Hello, I visited Obsidian Entertainment recently to take a look around and talk to some of the people that work there about the studio's massive contributions to the role-playing game genre. Well, actually, it's a bit more than just that studio's contributions. You see, there are a good number of developers working at Obsidian today that had previously worked together at Black Isle Studios on franchises like Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, Icewind Dale, and yes, of course, Fallout. And that last one is what we're going to focus on today. I spent an hour chatting with these three, Fergus Urquhart, Leonard Biorski, and Tim Kaine, all of whom had a big part to play in the development of both Fallout 1 and 2. We've published that entire interview, which you can go and watch right now if you prefer, but if you'd rather see something just a little more condensed, well, here are what I reckon to be the 18 best anecdotes they shared with me as we reminisced about the glory days of isometric RPGs. Number 1, pizza played a vital role in the creation of the original Fallout. Now, I'm sure many studios would make that exact claim. Pizza fuels half the games industry by the sounds of it, but this story is a little different. For the first few months in the development of Fallout 1, the only person working on the project was this man, Tim Kaine. He'd been told by his higher-ups at Interplay that he couldn't ask anyone to join his team, not yet at least. He was still in the very early stages of designing Fallout, it wasn't even called that at this point in time, but he needed people to bounce ideas off. So every time he did need help, he'd send a company-wide email explaining that at 6 PM that evening, which was outside of work hours, importantly, he'd be sitting in one of the conference rooms with a pizza. If anyone wanted to show up, talk over a few design ideas, and grab a couple of slices for their efforts, they were more than welcome. Usually around half a dozen developers turned up, including the game's future lead artist, Leonard Biorski, and it was during these conversations between mouthfuls of pizza that the very core of Fallout was really fleshed out. And there were some big decisions made here. For example, Fallout wasn't always going to be post-apocalyptic. Tim Kaine and his officially not yet a team took most of their initial inspiration from the GURPS tabletop games they'd been playing, at first thinking they might create a fantasy RPG, but this idea didn't really sit well with some members of the group. They'd either already been working within that genre, or just been watching a whole bunch of Mad Max 2 and wanted to make a game that felt sort of like that. But before they got to the post-apocalypse, there was another idea, and it was, it was quite different. Here's Tim Kaine remembering it with a surprising amount of detail more than 20 years later. Can you give me the pitch for that one again, if you can remember?
The dinosaur one?
Yeah, because it sounds kind of complex.
So, I remember it. It's really funny. Your girlfriend gets kidnapped. You go to the house she's kidnapped in, and at the bottom you find a statue. You're playing around with it, and these cultists attack you, drag you back to their lair.
It's like the Spanish Inquisition.
And pray to their god, and something happens, and you fall through this portal, and you're way back in the beginning of human history, and there's a crashed spaceship, and you get in. And you can't get into it because there's a monkey that is holding the spaceship key, and you kill the monkey and take the key and go.
Why has no one made this game?
The spaceship takes you to another planet ruled by dinosaurs.
Hang on, wasn't the monkey quite important to this as well?
It was very important. It turned out it was the hominid that was the human ancestor. So you get to this. You get to the. No, I'm sorry. You take it to a fantasy world, and there's a villain who's been attacking everybody, and he uses lightning bolts or something, but the only thing you found to wear on the spaceship was superconducting underwear. So whenever he shoots a lightning bolt, it just makes your underwear glow, and nothing happens to you. And so you beat him, and you get another wizard to cast a spell to send you back to your world, but your world has evolved without humans.
Because
so
you
killed the monkey.
Yeah.
So you're in this dinosaur world, and they have high tech and everything, and they put you in a zoo, and you're still wearing your superconducting underwear, and a PETA-like group breaks you out, and they take you to one of their scientists, and you explain to what happened, and he sends you in a time machine back to the moment of time, and you have to stop yourself killing the monkey.
Right.
Then everything unravels. And he gave you a way of putting yourself in suspended animation after you kill the monkey, so you don't have to use a spaceship. You go in suspended animation, and you look like a statue. When you come to, you're the statue that was in the basement.
Oh my god.
And you come out of it, you rescue your girlfriend, you wipe out the cultists, and everything's good.
If that was an elevator pitch, it would have to be quite a long elevator ride.
Yes.
And what's funny is it was 22 years ago, and I remember it like we were joking around about this.
I don't know. I remember that.
Number 3, the creator of GURPS didn't like what they were doing. So I've already mentioned that the early development of Fallout was inspired by the GURPS role-playing system. Well, on top of that, once development did properly kick in, and it wasn't just Tim Kaine and a box of pizza, Interplay licensed the use of GURPS within the game itself. This would eventually create a major problem for the team because the GURPS creator, Steve Jackson, disagreed with some of the decisions they were making. In particular, he had 2 issues with the game's design. Number one, he didn't like the execution scene in the intro, it was too violent, and there was a comparison to be made with a very real execution that had been photographed during the war in Vietnam. And number two, strangely enough, he also really didn't like the Vault Boy. Although, speaking with the team, it's still not exactly clear what his problem was. Regardless, Interplay and GURPS would eventually part ways because of these decisions, and if that hadn't happened, we may not have the Vault Boy today. Number 4, actually, while we're on the topic, the team that created Fallout 1 never called this character the Vault Boy. That name was given to him later on, only officially recognised in Bethesda's Fallout 3 more than a decade afterwards. Instead, they always called him either the Fallout Boy, or the Skilldex guy, or even the Monopoly guy, given that he was inspired by Monopoly's mascot, Rich Uncle Pennybags. Whatever they called him, of course, it was never, ever the Pit Boy. Come on now. Number 5, out with GURPS, in with Special. Following their disagreement with Steve Jackson, Interplay needed a new role-playing system to replace GURPS, and impressively they managed this from design to initial implementation in less than a week. At first, the team wasn't sure whether or not they should include the charisma stat in their setup, but without it, it turned out they'd only have 6 attributes. And, well, that was the same number being used by Dungeons & Dragons. So, no, of course, they had to have 7 instead. Number 6, SPECIAL. Yes, with charisma in place, we now have the special rule set. Special, as you'll know today, is an acronym for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. However, and I love this anecdote, for about a day after they had those primary stats laid out, the system was actually being called ACELIPS instead. It would take someone coming into Tim Kane's office and pointing out that they could rearrange letters to make it sound a little better for them to actually switch over. And even then, today, I'm not sure that Kane thinks that was the right decision to make.
I don't know, I like ACELIPS. It's kind of like...
Number 7, Fallout was almost cancelled more than once. As Interplay acquired the license for D&D, which was apparently an expensive acquisition, by the way, the Fallout team had to then justify the existence of their project, because Interplay could really use the developers that were on that team working on new D&D titles instead. And on top of that, there was a concern that Fallout may even end up competing with those games once they were out in the market. Tim Kane remembers a meeting he had with Interplay founder Brian Fargo in which he had to make a case for the game's continued existence, and he left that meeting feeling as if the project was probably going to get canned. Thankfully, this wouldn't be the case, although the team, which was only about a dozen strong at this stage, was told not to expect any more staff in the near future. Number 8, here's to the QA team. It wasn't too long, however, before Fallout looked like it actually might be a bit of a big deal. One moment stood out in particular when I asked the developers to remember exactly when they started to feel confident about this project. And yeah, they recall Interplay's QA team at one point being offered overtime during a really busy period for the company. This meant if they came in over the weekend to playtest a select number of projects, they'd earn time and a half for those hours. Instead, some of these QA testers started declining the offer, but coming in over the weekend anyway to continue playing Fallout instead, before the new build that came in the next week would wipe their save file. Kane remembers the lead QA manager coming to him at one point demanding to know why this was happening, and the answer was, they really liked the game. Number 9, the developers regret including a timer for the water chip quest. The original unpatched version of Fallout includes a somewhat controversial design decision that ties into the player's quest to track down a water chip. If they didn't complete the test within a certain time limit that was never properly disclosed, they'd lose the game, and a lot of players really didn't like this as it discouraged them from exploring or pursuing side quests, and it felt like wasting time as a result. Well, here is Tim Kane in his own words on that decision.
That's like the one thing, if I could go back and say if we could change one thing before we shipped, I would have taken that timer out and nobody would have ever known it existed.
Yep. Number 10, War. War never changes. The iconic intro to the Fallout games in which Ron Perlman tells us better than I can,
War never changes.
Well, it turns out those lines weren't in the original script at all. The day before this intro was meant to be recorded, Tim Kane saw what they intended to go with and really didn't like it. So, that night he decided to write his own take while watching The Simpsons, and then they asked Ron Perlman the next day to record both scripts. The team preferred Kane's writing. So yeah, the iconic couple of lines that we all associate so heavily with this franchise, they very almost didn't happen. Nice one, Tim. Number 11, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. Speaking of the intro, the original pick for the opening song was, yes, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots, but the band wanted too much money to license that track. So instead, Interplay opted for a very similar song called Maybe by the same band, and you should seriously listen to the opening moments of both songs, they're almost identical. Anyway, it's not clear whether Bethesda knew about this story when they then used I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire in the intro to Fallout 3, but Tim Kaine did tell me that his original notes about the game's music choices do now belong to Bethesda, and there's every chance they could have read them. Number 12, Scottish Heritage. Black Isle Studios, the RPG division of Interplay Entertainment, was named after the Black Isle in Scotland, thanks to Fergus Urquhart's family ties to the area. He's a little upset they didn't get to save this name for the company he would one day found, which of course they instead called OBSIDIAN Entertainment. And here's another bonus side fact, which you might have seen during the walk around of the studio that we recorded. But like a week or so after naming the company, one of the people on the team found a big old chunk of obsidian while digging in their garden. They polished it up and now display it very proudly in their reception lobby area. That's a bonus side fact, it doesn't really have a lot to do with Fallout. Back to number 13, Fallout loves a reference. Because work on Fallout 2 began just before the release of the original Fallout, the team was able to foreshadow the sequel in the final page of the first game's manual, with an advert for the Garden of Eden creation kit. I think that's really cool. Number 14, the Deathclaw. The design of one of Fallout's most deadly and iconic enemies, the Deathclaw, was based on a model of a Tarrasque from Dungeons & Dragons. The team was in a mad rush to complete the game, and very quickly, needed an extra monster to finish an area they were working on. And so they took a 3D scan of a model Tarrasque they kept around in their hallway, and worked into a different texture, tweaked the design slightly, and somehow, in a blurred frenzy of a rush, created an enemy that would last for decades. 15. Back to the manual. The Fallout manual design was largely based on an old US Navy field manual that one of the team's housemates had found in the trash. 16. The retcon. It wasn't until the team began working on Fallout 2 that the idea behind the vaults having an experimental nature was really talked about. This is now a core part of the Fallout universe, with each vault having a very distinct feel and atmosphere as a result, but this was a complete retcon. The original Fallout didn't consider vaults to be anything other than a place to survive the apocalypse. Number 17, Fallout 2 has a sex formula. This wasn't really referenced in the interview we did, but it's something I've spoken about in depth with some of the team's designers before now, and well, I just like to bring it up every so often. Go watch the video we did about it. I think it's really, really fun. And finally, number 18, the issue with the 1950s. I'll finish up with this anecdote from Leonard Bioski. I think it's interesting to hear him talk about how the games that he worked on are quite different at times to the more recent takes on Fallout from Bethesda. And yeah, very specifically, he talks about the 1950s style and how the more recent Fallouts don't quite share their original vision.
And that's another weird little detail about it that I think is different from how we were implementing Fallout than how some of the later games were implemented. We had this weird kind of more nuanced thing about it was the 50s style never died, but it was definitely the future, where some of the later games seem to be much more in that time period as well. Even though it's the future, it still has that. We were we advanced to the future, but the style was still, the stylistic remnants were still there. It's a fine point, it doesn't, but for us that was a big deal, and later games don't seem to have embraced that as much.
And there we are. Thank you for watching this condensed version of the conversation I had with some of the original minds behind Fallout. If you'd like to listen to that full 50-minute interview, you can find a link right here, as well as, once again, just think about watching that video about the sex formula in Fallout 2. It's great, come on. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, do let us know, and we'll see you next week with a big dive into the Fallout 3 that we never got to play. Cheers.